Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Future Publics, Democracy, Deliberation, and Future Regarding Collective Action, by Michael K. Mackenzie, narrated by Stephen Bell Davies. Preface. This project has been propelled by both hope and dismay. I began working on Future Publics more than 10 years ago, while doing my Ph.D. at the University of British Columbia under the supervision of Mark E. Warren. At the time, I was cautiously optimistic that democracies as we knew them would continue to improve. Over the last few years, my optimism has diminished considerably. I am worried that once stable democracies are increasingly vulnerable to existential threats. The rise of demagogues, racial and ethnic tensions, the rejection of truth, declining levels of trust, increasing income inequality, xenophobic nationalism, and the use of digital technologies to undermine rather than enhance inclusion and deliberation. On a personal level, I am, like many of us, daily confronted with the neglect and failures of previous generations. I am an assistant professor of political science at the University of Pittsburgh. I live with my wife and 4-year-old daughter in a pleasant mixed-income neighborhood that is near, but not too near, the campus. We walk, bike, and shop in our local area, and we have access to a functional, if not great, public transit system. We live near 2 large parks, Shenley and Frick, and up the hill from the Monongahela River. It should take 20 minutes to walk, with a 4-year-old, to the river near our house, but there is no safe or pleasant way to do so because the neighborhood is bisected by a busy multi-lane roadway. There is a sidewalk, but it is largely unused because it is mere inches from where the cars, trucks, and buses go whizzing by. The irony is that in order to enjoy the natural landscapes within walking distance of our home, we would need to drive to get there, thereby making a small contribution to destroying the nature we wish to enjoy. And much of the nature that is meant to have been preserved in our parks has, in fact, been destroyed. In Frick Park, near the river, there is a small creek, or run, as they are called in Pittsburgh. It's in a deep ravine that muffles the noise of the city, the traffic, car stereos, motorbike engines, and trains. The forest provides some pleasant shade on summer days, and a cool breeze often blows down the ravine. We would like to spend more time there with our daughter, but the creek has a foul smell because the city has allowed the sewage system to drain into it whenever there are heavy rains, which is quite often in Pittsburgh. The creek is also littered with plastic waste, shopping bags, toys, bottles, and many unidentifiable pieces of trash. I find this situation deeply depressing and an indictment of the past. We should be able to walk to the park without risking our lives in traffic, sit in the shade, and swim in the creek. It would not have been terribly difficult or costly for previous generations to have preserved these goods, even in urban environments, goods that nearly every generation before ours would have enjoyed without much thought. Now that these goods have been ruined, it will be costly and difficult, albeit not impossible, to resuscitate them. There are, of course, many other examples of humanity's failures to think and act in future-regarding ways. The Earth's life support system is being threatened by the burning of fossil fuels. We impose public debts on future generations without sufficient thought whether they will benefit from our borrowing. We build nuclear weapons that might destroy us, and nuclear power plants without thinking enough about what we will do with the waste they produce. which will be deadly for tens of thousands of years. We embrace new technologies without thinking enough about how they are likely to reshape our societies and our futures, or how they might, or should, be controlled through regulation. We allow ourselves to be constrained by constitutions that were written by and for previous generations. We are willing to spend public money on disaster relief, but not on taking proactive steps to help protect ourselves from disasters. We let our education systems and school buildings crumble, and our health systems falter, even though maintaining and strengthening them would be less costly than rebuilding them in the future. Most wealthy countries have done little or nothing to mitigate income inequality, even as their economies have grown. And most shameful of all, we have allowed the evils of racism and other forms of prejudice to persist and reproduce themselves every generation. Many of us think about the future as something that has to be predicted rather than shaped or created through our own individual and collective actions. One reason for this is that most of us have almost no influence over the larger forces that will shape our shared futures: societal drift, general inadvertence, invention. In other words, technological developments, market forces, and the actions of the rich and the powerful. In this book, I argue that we can rectify this situation only by making our democratic systems more inclusive and deliberative. This claim challenges the conventional wisdom that democratic systems are structurally myopic because of the short-sighted preferences of voters, the political dynamics of short electoral cycles, the fact that future others who will be affected by our decisions cannot be included in our decision-making processes, and the reality that democratic processes are often captured by powerful actors with dominant short-term objectives. All of these are real barriers to future regarding collective action, but inclusive and deliberative democratic processes are also the only means we have for making our shared futures together in collectively intentional and mutually accommodating ways. In March 2020, just after I finished writing this book, the World Health Organization officially declared the COVID-19 outbreak a global pandemic. Within weeks of that declaration, the world, our worlds, changed dramatically. Activities that used to be routine, such as going to the grocery store, taking the bus, going to public events, sending our children to school, going for dinner with friends, or flying around to visit people or attend academic conferences, have been changed beyond all recognition or curtailed altogether, along with our expectations for how ordinary life ought to function. It is easy to think of the pandemic as an act of nature. Pathogens are naturally occurring, continually evolving, and they have always threatened the survival of humanity and other species. But the COVID-19 pandemic is, sadly, another example of our neglect of the futures we are creating. Consider this statement from Joel E. Cohen that was published in the journal Science in 1995, and which now seems disturbingly prescient. As more humans contact the viruses and other pathogens of previously remote forests and grasslands, dense urban populations and global travel increase opportunities for infections to spread. The wild beasts of this century and the next are microbial, not carnivorous. The irony is that while urban density is a problem during a pandemic, regulating or preventing suburban sprawl would help mitigate the destruction of forests and grasslands, and thereby help keep us away from those pathogen-carrying species that we have so thoughtlessly intruded upon. The world has struggled to mount a coordinated global response to the COVID-19 pandemic, but governments have acted swiftly, if unevenly, to address the problem by restricting travel, banning large gatherings, forcing businesses to close, and regulating our social interactions. These restrictions may be effective. It is too soon to tell. But it is certain that they have weighed more heavily on some people than others. However stilted and uneven they have been, our collective responses to the pandemic prove that we can act swiftly to address global problems, even when such actions require paying significant near-term costs, which is precisely what must be done to address many of the long-term problems we face. At the same time, many experts and political leaders have thought about the pandemic as a short-term issue that requires a rapid response. In doing so, they have not thought enough about the potential long-term consequences of the actions we are taking to address the problem. Future generations will have to pay the massive public debts we have incurred during the pandemic. Some governments, such as Hungary's, have used the pandemic as an excuse to further undermine or eviscerate democratic institutions. Many millions or perhaps billions of people may be thrown into poverty because of the global economic slowdown. Public goods that are needed to fight climate change and other problems, such as urban density and public transportation, may be shunned and underfunded in the future. And social distancing rules threaten to lacerate the fabrics of our collective lives in ways that may be hard to repair. How do we balance the desire to protect people from something like COVID-19 with all the negative long-term consequences associated with whichever actions or inactions we take to address the problem? From a democratic perspective, collective decisions about how to balance irreconcilable concerns can only be made legitimate and thus acceptable if they are made in adequately inclusive and deliberative ways. The example of COVID-19 thus illustrates one of the central themes of future publics. We cannot navigate through the present or through any crisis situations and get to better futures if we do not have institutional mechanisms for ensuring that public decisions are made and guided by the publics they are meant to serve. Anything less will get us futures that have been created by drift, inadvertence, unchecked market forces, or powerful actors pursuing their own short-term interests and particular or peculiar visions of what desirable futures might look like. If we are honest with ourselves, and we are not very often, we cannot expect humanity to last forever. In Republic, Plato makes a distinction between becoming and being. The realm of becoming is where we live, where everything is always changing, improving, or decaying. The realm of being is the world of ideals, of knowledge, where things exist in unchanging forms. Living as we do in this world, we are always changing. We are always in the process of dying, for example, even when we are growing into the prime of our lives. Just as our political systems are always in the process of improving or decaying, or more accurately, improving in some respects and decaying in others. Adopting a long-term perspective compels us to admit that this great experiment in living on Earth, at least, cannot go on forever. But this conclusion, which must be true, is also beside the point in many respects. Future regarding action, as I understand it, should be aimed at balancing the legitimate concerns of the present with the potential interests and concerns of the future. This involves striving to make better, healthier, happier, more fun, productive, inquisitive, creative, and loving lives for people and other species now, without undermining the potential for future others to also enjoy those goods. We need to acknowledge and value the fantastic improbability, variety, and beauty of life as we know it, so that we might be compelled to act in ways that make it possible for life to continue for as long as possible, in whatever form it takes. We have a role to play in this, because we now know that humanity has the power to either help preserve or destroy human life, and many other lives on Earth. The human experiment might last for hundreds of thousands of years, achieve great things, and, most importantly, allow billions of future others to flourish and enjoy the things we have enjoyed, such as love, friends, family, parenthood, nature, music, literature, philosophical inquiry, or the satisfaction and challenges of creative or competitive pursuits. Or the human experiment may come to an end because of our own conscious or inadvertent individual and collective actions or inactions. This book is addressed to those who care enough about the future to think and hope that it should be the former and not the latter. We should strive, while we are here, to make futures that are better and not worse for future others, both humans and non-humans alike. Michael K. Mackenzie, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, August 2020. Part 1. Conceptual Background. Chapter 1. Introduction. The Democratic Myopia Thesis. 1.1. Introduction. We often ignore or dismiss the potential interests of our future selves and future others when we make collective decisions. We burn fossil fuels, even though doing so is unsustainable and damaging to the Earth's life support systems. We produce nuclear waste that will exist for thousands of years, even though we do not know how to store it safely for that long. We build cities that encourage, and often require, people to live in unsustainable ways, to drive everywhere instead of walking, cycling, or using public transportation. We embrace new technologies, such as genetically modified seeds and artificial intelligence, without making future-regarding collective judgments about how these technologies should be used, nurtured, and regulated, or whether they should be permitted. We spend millions of dollars responding to natural disasters, but we typically spend very little to prepare for them. We produce plastic waste that will not decompose for thousands of years. It is polluting our water systems, our bodies, and killing fish and other animals that we rely on for food. A lot of that waste comes from single-use products, such as plastic bags or other packaging materials. We are, in effect, willing to harm our future selves, future others, and many other living things for thousands of years in exchange for a few moments of convenience. To add to this, most governments make budgetary and borrowing decisions without adequately considering the potential interests of future people. In the worst-case scenario, we borrow money from future people, including our future selves, to do things that will harm them. The things that we do, individually and collectively, will shape the future. This is an ontological observation. We shape our natural environments and the social, cultural, and political worlds in which we live. We invent new things. We procreate or decide not to. All of our actions and inactions will affect the future, but there is something different about the modern period. Unlike most previous generations, we now know that we have existential power over the future. We have the power to decide whether humanity and the world has a future. Karl Jaspers, 1961, called this the new fact. For Jaspers, Our existential power over the future is epitomized by the invention of the atomic bomb, which is novel in essence because it contains within it the power of self-destruction. It is now possible for life on Earth to be wiped out by human action. More recently, scientists have argued that we are in a new geological era called the Anthropocene. As Stephen, Crutzen, and McNeill explain, in the past, the human imprint on the environment may have been discernible at local, regional, and even continental scales, but pre-industrial humans did not have the technology or organizational capacity to match or dominate the great forces of nature. Today, humanity is, in one way or another, becoming a self-conscious, active agent in the operation of its own life support system. The problem is that while we know our actions might have existential consequences, we do not know how to act in collectively intentional, future-regarding ways to get to the futures that we think we might want for ourselves and future others. There is also evidence that the pace of human activities, the rate of social, economic, cultural, technological, political, and environmental change is increasing. According to Stephen, Crutzen, and McNeill, the human enterprise after World War II suddenly experienced a great acceleration. At this time, human activity and productivity in nearly every field started to increase exponentially. Population growth, petroleum consumption, economic development, foreign investment, the number of automobiles, urbanization, water use, the damming of rivers, international travel, communications, and in general technological change. One of the consequences of this great acceleration is that each generation is becoming less like the previous one increasingly quickly, and this makes the life experiences of the present different from those of the past and the future. In contrast, for most of human history, each generation inhabited a world that was very similar to the one inhabited by the previous generation. Arthur M. Schlesinger, 1999, for example, estimates that while modern humans have lived on the earth for only about 800 lifetimes, there has been more scientific and technological change in the last 2 lifetimes than during all the others put together. As Benjamin Barber has pointed out, whilst for thousands of generations life for a cohort of grandchildren roughly resembled life for their grandparents, in our century there is enough change in a decade to confuse people in the 15 years it takes to grow up. William E. Schuerman has called this the social acceleration of time. Toffler called it future shock. These two observations about the modern period, we are now aware of our own existential power over the future, and the worlds we live in are changing increasingly quickly, make future-regarding collective action both critically important and especially difficult to do. As Schlesinger has observed, the law of acceleration hurtles us into an inscrutable future. The social acceleration of time makes it harder to understand what the long-term consequences of our actions are likely to be, and the rapid pace of change in so many different areas of human life means that we have to think holistically about how we are, or might be, affecting the future by our mere presence in the world. There is something intuitively problematic, something deeply wrong or unjust with the situation that we are in. We know that what we do will affect and possibly harm the future, but we find it difficult to act in collectively intentional, future-regarding ways. We have cognitive biases against the future. We tend to think more about our immediate needs and less about the potential interests of our future selves and future others. But most of us also care about the future. We worry about our own futures and the futures that we will or might leave for others. Many of us want to make the future better, but we do not know how to do so. What is particularly disturbing is that some of our most cherished institutions, our democratic systems, appear to be part of the problem, not part of the solution. Elected officials rarely look past the next election, or the one after that, to address problems that will have long-term consequences. Voters are often focused on their own near-term interests and concerns. They may be aware of longer-term problems, and they may wish to fix them, but when forced to choose, they are often unwilling or unable to forego near-term benefits for future potential gains, especially future benefits that they might not live long enough to enjoy. On this account, democratic systems are functionally short-sighted. Democracies tend to focus on the present, not when they are working badly, but when they are working well, when they are sufficiently responsive to the immediate needs and demands of affected publics. This argument, which I call the democratic myopia thesis, is a sort of conventional wisdom. It is one of those things that many scholars and pundits take for granted as a truth about democracy, without subjecting it to adequate critical scrutiny. In this book, I aim to rethink the democratic myopia thesis. I do not conduct empirical analyses to determine whether existing democratic regimes are more or less short-sighted than authoritarian alternatives. Instead, I challenge the assumptions that have been made by proponents of the democratic myopia thesis about what democracy is and what it might be. Democracies are often bad at making long-term decisions, but democracy, and in particular deliberative democracy, is also the only means we have for making our shared worlds, and thus our futures, together. In this book, I seek to articulate a deliberative democratic theory of future regarding collective action that focuses on the world-making, and thus future-making potentialities of democratic decision-making processes. It is true that our existing democratic systems typically fail to adequately empower us, as both individuals and collectivities, to make the futures we think we might want. But we nevertheless need inclusive, deliberative democratic processes to make our shared futures in collectively intentional, mutually accommodating ways. In this chapter, I outline the democratic myopia thesis as I understand it. Although it is often presented as a single argument, there are at least 4 interrelated but conceptually distinct claims that have been made by proponents of the thesis. The first draws on the observation that voters are often short-sighted. The second emphasizes the political dynamics of short electoral cycles. The third concerns the fact that future others who do not yet exist cannot be included in our decision-making processes, even though they will be affected by our decisions. The fourth deals with democratic capture, or the undue influence of powerful minorities, such as economic elites, who may have dominant short-term interests and the power to pursue them at the expense of the longer-term interests of society more generally. Scholars and pundits often fail to make distinctions between these different components of the democratic myopia thesis, but it is important to do so because each component of the thesis raises its own set of challenges and is associated with different possible solutions to the problem. In assessing the democratic myopia thesis, many scholars have come to the conclusion that democracies are incapable of effectively dealing with long-term problems such as climate change. In response, some have argued in favor of authoritarian alternatives to democracy. These scholars argue that authoritarian rulers will be better able to impose unpopular but necessary near-term costs and restrictions on the actions of otherwise unwilling publics and powerful economic actors. I accept certain components of the democratic myopia thesis, but I reject...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?